Presenting the work titled Validating the Western Aphasia Battery, revised through tele-assessment for the individual with aphasia.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for this opportunity. Most of the work has been done by my staff, Maria Dektiar, Emily Brown, Lindsay Fu, and below, and I was the lucky one to come to Crotone. So I'm going to talk about the Western Aphasia Battery. If you work with stroke individuals and work with aphasia, you know what this test is, and if you don't, then this is sort of a standardized language assessment for people who've had post-stroke aphasia. So we've been talking about this all morning, so I won't give you the bigger background for why the role of telepractice is increasing in all our different fields. This is a survey that came out in 2016, and it was conducted by the American Speech and Language Association in the US, and they asked clinicians in the field how often they were using telepractice in their work, and 64% of them said that they were using some form of telepractice in the US. And when they asked the speech pathologists what they were using it for, as you can see, 60% of these individuals were using it for assessment, and 96% of them were using telepractice for treatment. So whether we are prepared for this or not, it is something that we're all engaged in. Most of us are engaged in our clinical work, and it's only going to increase from this point on. More recently, a systematic review that was published in 2013 looked at telepractice in individuals with aphasia, and that's what I study. And they found 10 published studies. Of those, 4 examined tele-assessment, and they were done by Annie Hill and Deb's group, as well as a few others. And what they found was essentially that assessment, the tele-administration of different tests have been validated for some, but not all forms of language assessment. So if you're familiar, Boston Diagnostic Aphasia Examination is another measure, a comprehensive measure of language performance. The Boston Naming Test is a very quick 60-item naming test for people with aphasia. And then the story retell, people are asked to describe a story once they hear it. So these were the only sort of validated assessments for tele-assessments in this field. On the other hand, the Western Aphasia Battery is another assessment that has been around for quite a long time. It first came out in 1983 by Andrew Curtis, and it has been used a lot in the Western world, English-speaking world. It's a comprehensive test battery that's used to diagnose aphasia and assess the following. In terms of linguistic skills, it looks at speech, fluency, auditory comprehension, reading and writing, and it also has a non-linguistic component subtest to it, and that looks at drawing, calculation, block design, apraxia, Raven's colored progressive matrices. And if you're not familiar with the Western Aphasia Battery, the most important thing about this test is that at the end of this test, you get 3 summary scores from this test, which you do not get from the Boston Diagnostic Aphasia exam or any other comprehensive test. And it gives you a measure of overall language severity. So you get 1 number per patient, much like the way you get a Rankin score and modified ranking score and a FIM score and an NIH stroke scale. You also get a number of severity for each patient. And you get a measure of language severity, which is the aphasia quotient severity, which is overall language severity. And then you get a measure of language quotient and a cortical quotient. So now you actually have a quantitative measure of this assessment. People debate about how meaningful that is, but because of this numeric score you get for each individual, it has been gaining a lot of popularity. So more recently, myself, Pam Enderby, and a whole bunch of folks involved in stroke aphasia research were involved in a core outcomes measurement group. We all came together to agree on a set of outcome measures that will be used for the assessment of language, either in terms of impairment or functional communication and so forth. And this consensus paper that came out just this last year, essentially we agreed that the Western Aphasia Battery would be the majority, the main measure of language impairment. It had 74% agreement. But it has not been validated as a tele-assessment. So it's being increasingly used. It's been identified as a core outcomes measure for post-stroke aphasia, but it can only so far be given in person, and it has not been validated as in terms of tele-assessment. And so that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to start with trying to decide the feasibility and the validity of a video conference style assessment of the Western aphasia battery in individuals with chronic aphasia. And we wanted to also get a sense of participant satisfaction and comfort with this sort of tele-assessment, with the understanding that this is going to be a test that will be used more and more often as a primary outcome measure in randomized controlled trials. In fact, it has been used as a primary outcome measure in the last few randomized controlled trials in the US. So in this study, we had 18 people. They were sort of at the age of 56 with a standard deviation of 14. They were ranging in their chronicity, so the average months post-stroke was 70 months post-stroke, but it ranged, the standard deviation was 48 months. The average education was 16 with a standard deviation of 3 plus or minus years, and most of them were right-handed with the exception of a few. We looked at people who had stroke. We had 2 people who had a traumatic brain injury, and we had 1 who was diagnosed with both. And the design here was that each of these 18 patients essentially did both the standardized assessment and the in-person assessment and the video conference assessment. What we did was we randomized we counterbalanced the order of assessment. So half of them, we're trying to get to 20, but for now we have 18. And half of them would first do the video conference assessment, and then 7 to 14 days later, they would do the in-person assessment. And then the other half would do the in-person assessment first, and 7 to 14 days later, we would do the video conference assessment. And we have multiple data points on many of these patients, so we also ended up, and I'm not going to talk about that today, we ended up just looking at variability in performance. But the point here is that everybody is their own control. They're either been tested video conference or in person. And in person, they would either come to our clinic, or we would go to their home and sit in front of them and do the test. Video conference, we would do it either through Zoom meetings or GoToMeeting. And here's an example of how this test was administered, and I hope you can hear this. Okay, so this is the auditory comprehension piece of the assessment, and the main thing about Zoom and GoToMeeting is you can give the participant control of the mouse, and they can point to things and click on it, and you can record the data as they're doing that. Here's another part of the test.
Cue with your hands. So,
again, the main thing about this, the way we do it on Zoom is you can record the clinician, you can record the patient, and you can also see the screen at the same time. And here's how naming looks. The WOB has a naming component to it as well.
a spoon.
What about this?
Tape.
How about this?
A fork.
How about this?
Matches.
Okay, so those are some of the main pieces. Now on
excuse me, you have 3 minutes left.
Yeah, I'll get through it quickly. So on to the results. Essentially, what we found was there was no difference between the in-person and the video conference assessments. You can see the mean scores for both the in-person and video conference. When we look at either the AQ, LQ, or cortical quotient, we first did the intra-class correlation, and there's very high correlation based on whether they were administered the in-person or the video conference. And when we did t-test, there were just no differences between the in-person or video conference. Okay, so they're very consistent when we administer it this way. We also administered a sort of satisfaction survey of how they felt about the the in-person versus video conference, and I can talk about modifications in the question and answer, and that's why the survey becomes important, because we changed a couple of the tests. And as you can see, most of them were pretty comfortable with the technology that we used with them, and they were mostly satisfied with the way they were administered. 15 out of the 18 were equally satisfied, and the 3 of them who didn't express that much satisfaction felt so because they were uncomfortable with the technology prior to the study. And then lastly, we did a whole bunch of reliability in terms of our administration, because we did change a couple of things. We created a 32-item checklist to look at adherence to the Western aphasia battery protocol, and we documented every modification we made. I can get into that in the questions. And we had a third person do complete reliability in terms of the adherence to the test protocol and administration between assessors as well. And these data basically show you that the adherence to the protocol is, as rated by a third person, is 92%. And the adherence between administrators as they're doing the test differently across these sessions is between 89 and 94%. So it was really consistently scored and administered as well. So this is an important study because it validates administering Western aphasia battery in a remote setting with the kinds of modifications that you would need to do in order to administer it remotely. And it's really, for us, a very important step in terms of the treatment studies that we're doing, because a lot of our treatment studies are remotely delivered these days. We sit in Boston, we give patients in San Francisco treatment, and this is the first step to show that we can actually administer these tests reliably. And this is, I think, the beginning of doing such systematic studies for future work. Okay, I'll stop there and take questions.
Okay. Thank you. Do you have a
Yes,
question?
yes.
Thank you very much. That was great. I was just about to embark on this piece of work, so thank you for saving me from doing that.
Well, actually, it was your idea a year ago.
I would really like to know what you changed, please.
Yeah. I have my slides showing people what they changed. I can show you after the talk if we can't get back to it right now. But we did change the auditory comprehension pieces. Instead of using objects, which the Western aphasia battery does, we showed pictures of the objects. So we took the pictures. We changed the kinds of cues they got for the naming. So instead of giving them tactile cues, we essentially took that out of the scoring. And a lot of the things that had to do with, so in auditory comprehension, it says point to your light, the light above. We changed those to be around whatever their environment was. But we have documented everything, and I'm happy to share all the changes.
Okay, very good.
Yes, and that's what that 32-item checklist training is about.
Did you include people with different degrees of severity?
Yes.
And riding on that, did you have any difficulty with some people who were unfamiliar with technology? Did you have to go in and set it up?
Yes, excellent question. Again, I have slides on it that I don't have time to show you, but I can show you. But we did look at correlations in the difference between the remote and in-person testing, and we correlated that with severity, and nothing came up. So severity does not drive them to do well in person or video conferencing. There were a few patients who did slightly better. They did more than 5 points difference between in-person and video conference. So we flagged those people and we tried to see what was different about them. And for some people, it was just whatever test they did first, whether it was in person or video conference, was easier, and then they got more comfortable. But actually, the ones who did better on video conferencing. So that was it. The second part of your question about training, we absolutely had to train people. And one of the points that I had in my caveat slides in the appendix is that we definitely needed a caregiver at home to be able to help set them up.
Thank you, doctor.